Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Mittman, the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards at CADTH. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar entitled How CADTH's Expert Committees Deliberate. I wanted to start first by encouraging everyone who is participating today to think about the land where you are, the people who have been stewards of this land, and our shared responsibility to preserve the land and protect the land for future generations. So as such, I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Assiniboine, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I want to acknowledge and thank the generations of people who have taken care of this land. Let's have the next slide, please. So this is our standard CADTH disclosure statement. We receive funding from various ministries, from federally and provincially and territorially, and also receive funding from pharmaceutical industry. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today's topic is near and dear to my heart, and I'm really thankful and gratified to hear or to see so many people that share an interest in this particular topic and are taking the time today to participate in this session. Deliberation by expert committees is essential to CADTH's work. We have 3 expert committees, each one addressing different decision problems around drugs and technologies. It is essential to the credibility and the reliability of our work that people understand how our experts look at evidence, critically examine the issues, and come to an agreement on recommendations that they provide support for decision making. This webinar will cover what deliberative processes are and why they're important, and then making recommendations around impact for many people. You'll also learn about the deliberative process at each CADTH committee and how that is used to make recommendations. And you'll learn that there are some differences in deliberative processes around the globe and by different communities. We think it's important that the processes that we follow are consistent and are based on best practices. And so we'll also cover CADTH's processes and compare with similar expert committees in Canada and internationally. All of this will be useful to anyone interested in how CADTH works, but it's also intended, and this is truly the unique part of today's webinar, it is intended to primarily lay out the foundation for a consultation process and session that we'll have later on next week on February 11th with patient groups. We've been working closely with the patient groups and to create this 2-part consultation to support and widen participation and input from patients and patient groups. And I do have to say this idea was generated for having this in a virtual format by listening to patient groups and having some in groups indicate that they would just like us to follow one committee's process. And when we delved a little bit deeper about what does that process look like, there was really variability in understanding of that process. So hence today we're here. I'd like to thank from the patient groups that we've been working with, Louise Binder from Save Your Skin Foundation, Antonella Scali from the Canadian Psoriasis Network, and Martine Elias from Melanoma Canada for their assistance with planning this 2-part session. Now I'd like to turn it over to Martine Elias to say a few words of welcome. Over to you, Martine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mittman, and for the entire CADTH team to inviting me to welcome all of you today's meeting so we can learn about the CADTH Expert Committee deliberation. A topic gauging by the number of people who are online today is of great interest. So my name is Martine Elias. I am the Executive Director of Myeloma Canada. And Myeloma Canada is the only national charitable organization created by patients for patients that are impacted by multiple myeloma. For those who may not know, multiple myeloma is commonly called myeloma, and it's a cancer of the plasma cell found in the bone marrow. So it's a cancer of the immune system. A few months ago, when Dr. Mitt and her team, Tamara, Julie, Sarah, and Marina, approached a group of patients, leaders, to seek our advice and to include us in the development of this consultation on the patient's perspective of the deliberative process, we were thrilled. We thought this was a wonderful opportunity for us. And I want to thank Louise Binder, who you probably all know, and she is a lawyer and a fierce health advocate who has been involved in informing the development of health policy and systematic treatment access practices from patients' perspective since the early 90s, subsequent to her diagnosis with HIV. Since then, she has applied her experience and her knowledge to the cancer world and is currently a health policy consultant with the Savior Skin Foundation. Antonella Scali, who is the executive director of the Canadian Psoriasis Network currently, but previously she's had an extensive experience involved in mental health, excuse me, in patient organization. And myself, sorry, I am also the chair of Connected, which is a network of cancer patient organization that endeavors to work together with decision makers, healthcare professional, and industry to promote greater education, understanding of immuno-oncology, and ensuring that Canadians have equal and timely access to these therapies, as well as understand companion diagnosis and supportive care and what role they play in ensuring patients' care. We're delighted to be involved in today's meeting, and we're able to share our ideas and insights in the development of the objective of this meeting. You see, patient engagement is something that is very important. And whenever there's health policy or decision making that affects us, it's important that we are there. Someone told me in the past that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we certainly don't want that. The HTA process and patient engagement has come a long way. When it started about 12 years ago, we could say as patients that it was a good start, but there was a lot of improvement that needed to be done. And 12 years later, we're happy to say that we're in a much happier place right now. And of course, improving the deliberative process or any process that affects patient and patient decision about healthcare resources is really important for us. And as Nicole alluded earlier, this patient deliberative process is something that's fairly new for us in terms of understanding how it works. So we provide information to CADTH, they review it, they dissect it, they discuss it, but we don't really know what happens in the belly of the beast. So this gives us the opportunity to look inside and to see how the surgeon actually does his surgery. So this is why today we're going to spend most of the time learning about the deliberative process, and next week we are going to provide our input. It's really important for us as patients to let our voices heard. As one of our patient advocates, David McMullen, said previously, is that if you're not there to give us or tell them what we need, how will they find out? So that's why it's important for us to provide our input. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that today was World Cancer Day. This is the day the cancer community gets together to create awareness about cancer, about the millions of people living with cancer across the world, and for the 220,000 patients in Canada who will be diagnosed this year. It's important that we know and that we care and that we look for cures. As patients advocate, we do our job, and our job is never to give up. So on behalf of Louise, Antonella, and myself, thank you, Dr. Mittman, and everybody else at CADTH for including us today. So let's get going. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Martine. I'd also just like to acknowledge the significant contributions from the CADTH patient engagement team, in particular, Sarah Berglis, Tamara Rader, and Julie Boucher. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge today's presenter, Marina Richardson. She's a clinical research officer at CADTH, but is simultaneously working on her PhD. She doesn't sleep much these days, and Marina will be our lead-off speaker for today's session. But again, before I turn things over to Marina, we just wanted to talk about some housekeeping. Today's session will be mostly didactic with a question and answer period at the end. Feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom control bar. Hopefully you're familiar with that with 11 months of doing this all together. We'll get through as many questions as we can. We'll monitor them in the background. And finally, a reminder that this session is being recorded and will be available on CADTH's YouTube channel by tomorrow, and we'll have slides available on PDF on our events page. The next slide, please. So this is all gearing up to our consultation with our patient groups, which will be on February 11th. These are the questions that we're going to be asking, and Martine highlighted some of them with respect to what information are we using, how do we communicate, and what information is important in the deliberation process. And this is really part of a larger initiative where we're looking at can we harmonize some of the deliberation that we do here at CADTH. So as part of that, as this consultation is a new thing for CADTH, doing this sort of video, taking advantage of the video availability of individuals rather than a written consultation here at this point. So with all of that, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Marina. Thanks very much.
Great. So thanks, Nicole. So today we are going to cover 3 buckets of information. So first, we're going to talk about choices. So we have decisions to make. We aren't talking about decisions at the patient provider level. We're talking about decisions at the population level with respect to public spending in healthcare. So next, we're going to talk about CADTH's 3 expert review committees. So as has been mentioned, we have 3 expert committees, one for oncology drugs, one for non-oncology, and one for non-drug technologies. So we'll discuss some of their features, similarities, and differences. And lastly, we're going to sort of travel around the world and highlight features of expert review committee processes at other HTA agencies. And as we do this, I'm really going to highlight the importance of keeping context in mind as we make these comparisons. So first off, we have decisions to make. And I mentioned that's because our public money can't afford to buy everything. Often we have to decide if a new treatment is worth the greater cost or if an old treatment is still worth paying for. If it's a new treatment for which there's no existing treatments, we also need to decide if the benefit and really the certainty in that benefit is worth the cost, because spending money on a particular treatment may also have an impact on the public money that we have available to spend in other areas, both within the health system, so on other disease areas, for example, or in other sectors, for example, spending money on schools or infrastructure. So just like each of us has to decide how much money we want to allocate to food, clothing, shelter, and if we're privileged enough, perhaps entertainment, we have to decide how to best spend public money. So in healthcare, health technology assessment and deliberative processes are used to help support these decisions. So what actually is HTA and why deliberative processes? So here is a definition of HTA. So this is an internationally agreed upon definition, just recent actually, and I'll let you read through it. But essentially, HTA is a process that uses methods to determine the value of a technology to inform decision-making for the purposes of informing our health system. So essentially, HTA helps ensure that those decisions that we want to make are making the best use of public money. And so let's just pick up on this idea of value. So what do we actually mean by value? So in the context of HTA, value has been defined as an overall and balanced description of the positive and negative aspects of a situation. Some dimensions of value of a health technology may include things like the clinical evidence, economic, other things such as social, cultural, legal issues, and importantly, patient, relatives, and caregivers and the population. Now, not all assessments of value are driven by the same criteria or conditions, and we often really don't have perfect data for any of these categories of information. So we really also need to consider the aspects of the situation that we don't know. And I think importantly to note is that the overall value of a particular technology, such as a medicine or a medical device, may really vary depending on the perspective that you take, the stakeholders that are involved, and the decision context. So I mentioned stakeholders, perspectives, values. So who are the stakeholders of interest? So when you consider decisions involving healthcare, there are actually many perspectives and stakeholders involved. And value can mean different things to different people. So we have, for example, patients, we have the public, we have providers, policymakers, principal investigators, product makers, payers, purchasers. And I'm sure hopefully each of you can find yourself in probably one or more of those stakeholders. And I'm sorry if you don't feel that you're included in any of those, but I found this a useful taxonomy to really outline the number of different perspectives that are out there and the number of values that we have to consider as we make these decisions. And given that the webinar today is really setting the stage for next week's session with patient and public groups, I'd like to emphasize that patients really do have an important role to play in providing their or your perspectives on what value means to you to help inform these spending decisions. So you can see that decision making can become very complex with all of the different stakeholders involved. With many different stakeholders, we have different values, different perspectives, and with the incorporation of facts, and as you can see, even facts have values, it just increases the complexity of the decision making even more. So now I'm going to include a quote here, and it's quite a lengthy quote, but I think the essence is saying that it's unlikely that all stakeholders are going to agree on a particular recommendation. So the process by which these decisions are made becomes very important, which is why we're all here today, all coming together next week. And deliberative processes, they really allow for bringing together these facts, values, and perspectives. So what actually are deliberative processes? So there are actually several definitions of deliberative processes dating back over 15 years ago. So we've just highlighted a few here. The first one, for example, deliberative processes have been defined as a process that allows a group of actors to receive and exchange information or to critically examine an issue. It's also been described as a process that is intended to improve the quality of decision-making by allowing for mutual decision-making based on facts. So in health technology assessment, it often takes the form of an expert or advisory committee, but currently there's no agreed upon definition or standard for deliberative processes. So before we continue on, I'd like to just take a step back for a minute and sort of reposition ourselves into what lens and perspective we're taking when we talk about the decisions that we're making. So here is illustrated a general schematic of the health technology life cycle. So for example, when a new technology comes out, we have product development, then goes through market authorization or Health Canada approval for safety and efficacy. It comes to health technology assessment, pricing and reimbursement, and then post-market evaluation. So what actually happens when a product gets into use by patients. And some of you may argue that this isn't the right way of conceptualizing the process. Things could occur in different orders, but the point of this is that HTA, or health technology assessment, is just one part of this process. And then within HTA, HTA itself is a process, and it's a process that involves scoping a particular topic or technology, involves assessing, appraising, or contextualizing the evidence, and then implementation and monitoring of the particular decision. And deliberative processes can really fall within all aspects of HTA. And there was a guide, a very useful guide developed in the Netherlands that covers deliberative processes throughout each stage of this health technology assessment process. But importantly, we are really focused on the appraisal portion or contextualization part of the HTA process, which typically involves a committee, not always, but it is the deliberative aspect that we're looking at today. And you can see that we've defined it here as an input, throughput, output process. And again, we've used great work done by Ken Bond and his team with the HTAI Global Policy Forum that took place, I guess, around this time last year, that really focused on deliberative processes in HTA. So it's a very useful way, I think, of conceptualizing all the different elements that are involved within the deliberative process. And so just continuing on that thought, so if we use the input, throughput, output model to help us sort of define what we mean by deliberative processes, we can see that it is essentially 3 different steps. So the first is consideration of inputs. So this is the collection of evidence, information, and perspectives. And then we go on to throughput. So this involves collecting or critically examining evidence and information and sort of weighing the reasons of a particular consideration. So that's at the throughput stage. And then we have output, which is involving communicating the outcome or content of the deliberation. So I guess our focus really is on the throughput step of this process, but it's important to keep in mind that the input, so stuff that comes to the committee, as well as the output, so what comes out of the committee, there is overlap in it, and we have to keep in mind that the input and output stages do have an influence on what happens at the throughput. So just to give you some examples of some common considerations that we would think of when we talk about deliberative processes. So again, focusing on what happens at the committee table, we're considering, okay, who is at the table? What type of person is there? What are conflicts of interest declared? Are we talking about open meetings or closed meetings? What does the recommendation document look like? And is there public disclosure of the meeting? And then what we can also talk about what many have seen as less common considerations, but still important to include and consider as we talk about deliberative processes, are things like, what is the role or influence of the committee chair? Are there informal discussions at breaks? How are power dynamics balanced? Are there opportunities if one expert committee member has a different opinion? What opportunities are there to present that, and how is that facilitated? And what is the format of the meeting? So, how is the evidence presented? In what order is it presented? And given the times right now, what is the impact of virtual sessions? So all these are considerations that I encourage you to keep in mind as we think about deliberative processes in the context of HTA. So that was quite a bit of information. You know, we've talked about that we have decisions to make. We've talked about HTA and deliberative processes, how they are used to support this decision making. So before I move on, I'll just take a quick pause and just look to my team to see if there's anything that we want to clarify before we move forward to look at the CADTH expert review committees.
Marina, there are a number of questions, but I think they're okay for after the next session.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, I'll move on to talking about how CADTH fits in and talk about specifically what happens at the deliberative committees that we have. So just a quick brief reminder of who CADTH is, what we do. So CADTH is an independent, not-for-profit organization. So we have several products, as you can see, products and services on this slide that we use to support public decision makers with evidence to inform their decision making. So the focus of today's sessions are on products or services for which there's a recommendation being issued. And so that falls within our reimbursement reviews. So through the means of our oncology reviews and our non-oncology reviews, and also includes outcomes from our health technology reviews where there are appropriate use recommendations from an expert committee. So this is just meant to show that there are many ways that we provide decision makers with evidence to support their decision making, but our focus is really on these two buckets of recommendations. So we've mentioned a few times so far that CADTH has 3 expert committees. So the first one I'll go through is the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, or CADTH. And so this committee looks at non-oncology drugs. The second committee, the Decoder Expert Review Committee, or PERC, looks at oncology drugs. And then we have the Health Technology Expert Review Committee, or HTERP, that looks at non-drug technologies. So this could include things like medical devices. And so I realize this is a bit of a text-heavy, dense slide, but it's meant to outline some of the similarities between the 3 committees. So each committee, we all consider patient perspectives. We all have a deliberative portion of the appraisal at the meetings. There are a group of experts along with the committee chair. Each of our committees has an ethicist, health economists, healthcare practitioners. There are no industry representatives on our committees. The meetings are recorded, but they're not disclosed to the public. And one of the reasons, we do have to consider is the disclosure of confidential information that is often submitted as part of companies' submissions. So that's, we can talk about that at great length, but that is one of the reasons why we can't disclose the meeting recordings to the public. And then importantly, our relationship to decision making. So it's important to emphasize here that our committees provide recommendations to decision makers, and these are non-binding recommendations. And you'll see when we move into the last part of the presentation, that does differ depending on the jurisdiction that you're looking at. And then moving on to some differences. So there are many differences. However, a lot of these are a result of our 3 committees just simply evolving differently. So again, similar to the previous slide, we've just pulled out a couple of features to highlight here. So you can see that for CDEC and PERC, so our drug review committees, there are monthly meetings, variable number of drugs at each meeting. And this compares to HTERP, where they meet less often, but able to have meetings as needed. You'll also notice on here for the committee structure. So I've put patient and public members in quotes, and I'm highlighting this because it's important to really understand the use of that term. I'll bring this forward on a future slide, but it is important to really emphasize that although the names are different for both CDEC and PERC, being referred to as public and patient members, their role of ensuring that the patient experiences and perspectives are brought forward during the committee deliberations are exactly the same. So our public members and our patient members on PERC and CDEC, they haven't necessarily experienced all of the diseases or been carers for all of the diseases that come to the committee tables for discussion, but they are incredibly diligent at giving voice to the perspectives and experiences of patients through the input that is provided by patient groups and from their own experiences and perspectives as patients, as carers, and as members of the public. And likewise on HTERP, we have a public member who is intended to ensure that broad public interest is considered, but again, has experiences and perspectives as well. And additionally, on our committees, there is an opportunity, depending on the technology, to bring in additional expert members. So you'll see that with CDEC, for example, for plasma protein products, there is a subcommittee of CDEC, the Plasma Protein Product Expert Committee, that is convened for those products. And then depending on the technology for HTERP, additional clinical experts may be called in for those reviews. And then also different across our 3 committees is the receptor of the recommendation. So if you recall, our committees provide that recommendation to decision makers, And these may include public drug plans, Canadian Blood Services, cancer agencies, and then jurisdictions for HTERP. I'll get into this a bit more on the next few slides. But for our non-drug technologies, it's a bit of a different process in terms of how topics are prioritized. So there must be a need from at least one public decision maker for a topic to move forward. So again, not expecting you to be able to read any of this, but it's just showing you, intended to show you what you would see if you were to search for deliberative processes for each of our 3 committees on our website. So these are essentially snapshots of the related documents on the CADTH websites. And again, simply by nature of our committees evolving differently over time, there are different frameworks that you see here. And I won't go into too much detail, but each framework generally includes considerations for patient and care perspectives and experiences, clinical evidence, economic evidence, implementation considerations. And these are all of the pieces of information that go into the committees during discussions and deliberations. And you'll notice that for HTERP, there are a greater number of domains that are listed, but it's important to note that not all of these considerations are necessarily included in each review. And we take a tailored approach to these reviews depending on the nature of the question that is coming from our decision makers. So with that, I'll go into our CDEC committee, so non-oncology drug review committee first. And so we framed it in using the components of the deliberative process that we talked about previously with the input, throughput, output process. And so I'll just highlight before I get into the details that the processes that I will be presenting are really reflective of the changes that are being implemented as well as part of the pharmaceutical reviews alignment process. So this particular pertains to CDEC and PERC, the first 2 committees that I'll discuss, and just to keep that in mind as we go through. So for CDEC, so again, I'm just going to walk through what happens during the committee meetings according to this idea of first collecting evidence, information, and perspectives, then looking at the throughput, so what actually happens at the meetings, and then the output, so what happens, how do we communicate the outcome and the content of the deliberation. So first off, we have the input stage. So this involves, for our drug reviews, a sponsor submission, so a submission from a manufacturer. We also receive input from patient groups, from clinician groups, and from our decision makers or the payers. And so these pieces of information then feed into our CADTH evidence reports. So this is collection of the clinical and economic information, as well as patient input, and a number of other supporting material, including, for example, original patient input submissions. And when CADTH completes their evidence reports, these reports are then provided to the committees, and the committees, it's set up so that 3 committee members are assigned to a particular review, and they prepare reports based on the CADTH evidence reports for which they will present during the actual committee meeting. So then you have the throughput stage where we actually critically examine the evidence, weigh the reasons, and I've just highlighted here a sample agenda. So this is just a generic sort of to give you an idea of what actually happens. So the meetings start with approvals, start with conflict of interest declarations, and then depending on the number of drugs under review, they're discussed according to this general process. So first, the public member makes a presentation where they describe the patient and clinician input, provide their perspectives, and they really set the stage and provide the context for the whole discussion. Then there's the presentation of payer or decision maker input on implementation issues. Again, this helps sort of frame or contextualize the discussion. If relevant, there is an ethicist presentation. And then there are presentations by 2 committee members on the clinical and the economic evidence. And then clinical experts, as well as the CADTH review team, are there to provide input, to provide clarifications to anything that may have come up during the initial evidence presentations. And then once all of the information has been presented, the committee deliberation occurs. And so this is a very dynamic discussion that is managed by the chair to ensure that all perspectives are brought forward, that there are opportunities for each member to voice their perspectives. So this could involve questions being asked, clarifications of data inputs, reminders of what was heard from patient group input, considerations of what products are out there. Is there any unmet need? Are there any potential access issues for patients? And really weighing the uncertainties in the evidence base and to see if there's any gaps in the evidence. So those are just some examples, as I said, very dynamic discussion. And then based on the evidence and the deliberations, there's a recommendation put forward to reimburse, not reimburse, or reimburse if one or more conditions are satisfied. Then there is an anonymous majority vote. And if the recommendation does not achieve a majority vote, the recommendation may be revised following additional deliberation until a recommendation passes by the committee. And then that continues depending on the number of drugs being reviewed. Each drug lasting approximately 1 to 2 hours, but again, that can vary depending on the nature of the technology. And then following the deliberations and the recommendations, a draft recommendation is issued, and this includes the recommendation itself. Any conditions, for example, if there are any specific patient populations that it applies to, if there's specific initiation criteria, renewal criteria, discontinuation, pricing conditions, and it also includes the reasons for the recommendations. So this is intended to provide details as to how the committee landed on their particular recommendation, and also includes a summary of discussion points, which is also intended to reflect the discussion that ensued at the committee. And also included in the recommendation document is a summary of evidence, which also includes what was heard from patient group input. So after the draft recommendation is issued, there's an opportunity for stakeholder feedback. If a request is made from the manufacturer or submitter, or the decision maker, the payer, for clarification, depending on the nature of the request and the feedback provided, may go back to the committee for at a future meeting for future discussion, or a final recommendation is issued. So I realize that was a lot to likely take in, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how everything sort of comes together with the information being collected, the meeting occurring, the deliberations that happens, give you a sense of the order of how things are done, and then how that discussion deliberation is then reflected in the recommendation and how it proceeds from a draft to a final recommendation. So that is for CADTH. So that is our non-oncology drug review committee. And actually it's very, very similar as we move on to our oncology drug review committee, or PERC. So, you know, pretty much all of what I just described applies here. So I'll run through it again just to give you a sense of how it all works again. So first of all, sponsor submission is received. We have a call for patient, clinician input and payer input. This feeds into CADTH evidence reports, then feeds into the committee members drafting their reports for presentation during the meeting. I should also mention that all committee members receive the evidence submissions and supporting material, including if there's any additional input from, for example, clinician panels. So all of the information that we have available does go to the committee for their consideration. And then again, similar to what occurs at CDEC, PERC undergoes a similar process, and including patient member presentation of the patient and clinician input. And then through to deliberations, a draft recommendation being issued, opportunity for stakeholder input, and then a final recommendation. So those were our two drug committees. So now moving on to HTRP, our non-drug expert review committee. And this is where there are more differences that I'm going to highlight, just because of the nature of the process, as well as just the evolution of the committee. So the first difference that arises is at the input stage. So if you recall, for the drug submissions, there is a sponsor submission. In this case, topics that undergo review at HTRP, they undergo a prioritization, topic identification, and scoping process that is very different from our drug review process. And with that includes a plan for patient engagement. So patient engagement is developed in the very early stages of a review, and it's involved in the planning and protocol development stage. And it could actually include engaging up to 5 patient collaborators or persons with lived experience with the particular disease under consideration. And this really helps to interpret the evidence, helps with setting it up with an appropriate plan for sharing the outcome of the review. So patient groups are contacted very early in the process to help identify patients that we can essentially talk to before the review starts and as the review proceeds. So depending on the question being asked by the decision maker and the topic under review, the CADTH evidence reports within the technology may look very differently for each review. That is speaking to, again, that tailored approach to depending on what the decision problem is. So, and then another difference compared to our drug reviews is that when the CADTH reports are finalized, CADTH develops evidence summaries for presentation during the meeting. So if you recall with our drug committees, the committee members are the ones to develop and deliver presentations during the meeting. Whereas in this case, we have the CADTH team or the review team doing those presentations. And I'll also highlight here that there are many more check-ins with the committees at various stages of the review process, such as protocol development and draft reports. So hence the back and forth arrows here between the input and the throughput or at the committee table. So I've also included here a bit of a sample agenda. Again, as I mentioned, because the reviews are tailored to meet the needs of the decision makers, this order of presentation of information may look differently depending on what technology is under review, but similar sort of structure in that, you know, there's a framing of the decision problem, there's a review of the patient engagement, clinical review, economic review, there may be a perspectives and experiences review from the literature, could be an ethics review, a summary of stakeholder consultation. And then likewise, a similar dynamic deliberation occurs at our HTRP committee as well. And then draft recommendations are issued. And again, opportunity for stakeholder feedback, which may result in it going back to the committee for additional deliberations. And then there's an issuance of a final recommendation. So again, by the nature of the process, it does look a bit different from our drug committees, but there are still several similarities that you can see throughout the process. So again, that was probably quite a bit of information, but it was to give you a sense of what actually happens at these expert committee meetings and some of the similarities and differences across our 3 committees. So next, we are going to move into features of deliberative processes around the world. So we're going to go through a select number. I think we've highlighted 4 different countries here. But before we do so, I'd like to just talk about why language matters and why context matters. And this is important to start to think about, before we jump into look at what other jurisdictions are doing, because there are certain reasons why things are done the way they are, just based on how the system is set up. So I'm going to start off by showing you why language matters with an illustration. This is just one illustration, one example, but I'd encourage you to keep in mind why language, why the details matters as we think about deliberative processes, both at CADTH, but also as we look at exploring opportunities in other countries. So here's our example. So if I say that there is a patient member on the committee, what do you think this implies? Do you think this implies that they have lived experience with the disease under consideration? Do you think they are a caregiver caring for someone with the disease? Or do you think about their roles and responsibilities? For example, do you think that they're responsible for bringing forward the patient perspectives? Are they supposed to represent all patients with the disease? And how do you suppose this is different from a public member? And do you think about their duration of committee membership? So are they a standing committee member, or does this depend on the review? Do they have a vote? Now, these are a whole bunch of different considerations that I think everyone likely has different ideas of what it means to be a patient member. And so when we think about what it means to be a patient member, I encourage you to really think about what it means beyond being called, for example, a patient member or a patient expert or a patient representative. Could be called even just simply using the name as an expert member. It's important to just think about, what does that expert member do and what do they bring to the table? So, we don't necessarily need to even call a patient member, but an expert member if we think about and really describe what it means to be that particular member on the committee. So again, this is just one example, but I'm sure everyone has a different perspective on what it would mean to have that sort of patient voice at the table. So I just encourage you to keep that in mind as we look at other jurisdiction practices and, gearing up for next week's session. I'm really thinking about the details about what is important for you to see in that. And then in addition to language, it's also important to keep in mind context. So there are a lot of HTA agencies around the world that are doing very similar things to what is done in Canada. And we can learn from them and they can learn from us. And I'm going to highlight a few features that we found interesting from the US, the UK, Scotland, and the Netherlands. But as I do, I want you to keep in mind it's important when we start to compare our practices to other agencies that we keep in mind things like, are there time constraints? Do you have to get things done in a specific amount of time? Consider what the technology or condition is that we're considering. Also consider what is the relationship between the HTA body and the decision maker. So I mentioned our committees make recommendations, not the actual decisions. So that is different depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at. And really, are there any jurisdiction or country specific social values that need to be considered during deliberations and in setting up a specific deliberative process? So we'll start into some other examples now, but just encourage you to keep that in mind as we go through. So first off, looking at our neighbors to the south. So the HTA body there is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. So they're actually an independent consultancy funded by non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations. So this is different than what we see in Canada, where most of our funding does come from government sources. So ICER looks at pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical products. They have 3 independent advisory appraisal councils that convene to deliberate on these pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so just a few features on these next couple of slides that are interesting. So we see that, on a typical agenda, this is one day's agenda looking at one particular technology. And this is in comparison to, for example, at CADTH, where we have multiple technologies to discuss at a single meeting. And then also interestingly, at committee meetings at ICER, there are 1 or 2 patients and even industry that are eligible for 5 minutes of speaking time during the meeting. So they actually, you can see this just circled the clock here. So in real time, a patient or industry member has 5 minutes of speaking time where they can speak to, I guess, their perspective on the value of a particular technology. And then another interesting feature, so after discussing the clinical and economic evidence, the committees have considerations for other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations. So this is sort of and again, you likely can't read any of this, but you may have seen it illustrated in ICER's value assessment framework for 2020 to 2023. And this is sort of the way that ICER has operationalized the consideration of these other factors. And they're factors which may suggest a technology may provide higher or lower value for money. So this is an opportunity for committee members to look at, for example, the level of uncertainty in the evidence, if this technology has a differential benefit to a historically disadvantaged or underserved community, if there's impacts on caregivers and family, if there's impact on return to work. And this is interesting because in real time, you can see the voting results from the committee members. And then this actually moves to, this is a schematic that's showing you the intent of those discussions. So the intent is to have each of those considerations being considered in the context of, does this technology suggest that it offers higher value for money or lower value for money? So again, just an interesting different way of doing things. And I imagine, there are many of you on the line who have ideas, have seen different practices at other organizations, or maybe employees or members of other organizations. And I really encourage you to provide comments. We're always welcome to hearing them if you have ideas. So feel free to add to the Q&A as well. So now moving on to NICE in the UK. So at NICE, which is the HTA agency in the UK, there are multiple advisory committees depending on the nature of the technology. So as you can see, there's one for highly specialized technologies, diagnostics, public health. And a key distinction compared to CADTH is that these committees provide binding recommendations. And if you recall, we provide non-binding recommendations. And that's just one consideration to keep in mind as we move forward. So a few features, again, similar to ICER, just highlighting a few that are interesting here. This meeting actually takes place in 2 parts. So the first part is typically a public session that may include things like a technical briefing, highlighting of key issues, clinical cost questions for committee members. And then similar to ICER, there's actually the inclusion of industry or patient representatives during the meeting. And that could be to provide context, to provide evidence clarification. And then following part 1, so that's the public session, then it moves into a closed session where confidential information is discussed and final recommendations are decided. Now moving on to Scotland. So this is just focusing on the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and this is looking at just pharmaceuticals. And interestingly, a feature of the Scotland SMC is that there's actually two committees that exist, and they're advisory committees. And the first one is a technical subcommittee, which first reviews the technical information, which then feeds in to a full deliberative committee, the SMC, which issues recommendations to the National Health Service of Scotland. And another feature of this committee that is interesting is this idea of a patient and clinician engagement meeting. And so if a technology is unlikely to be recommended by the committee based on the technical subcommittee review, and the company requests it, PACE or patient engagement and clinician meeting can be convened to allow for a greater discussion of the benefits of medicine that may not be fully captured in the conventional assessment undertaken by the SMC. So it really, from what I can see, it gives patient groups and clinicians a stronger voice within SMC decision making. And then lastly, the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, again, another example of a sort of two-step committee. The first one considering the scientific evidence base underlying the HTA report, and then the appraisal committee considering the balance between the cost effectiveness, severity of disease, and other considerations, including, for example, societal considerations. And then just one feature of the Netherlands that I thought you might find interesting is an example where specific decision criteria are used within the deliberations. So this is a specified cost effectiveness threshold according to severity of disease. So again, all of these from these 4 jurisdictions just really highlight the breadth to which there exists a range of different processes, features, frameworks for deliberative processes around the world. So with that, we've gone through talking about why we have decisions to make, talked about the CADTH review committees, we've talked about some select examples of other jurisdictions. And so hopefully that gives you a good overview of what deliberative processes are, why we do them, and what some other practices are that we could consider in Canada as we move forward. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole, who's going to talk about where to go from here.
Thanks very much, Marina. What an excellent review of all of the very difficult, often principles that we actually have to translate to make sure that people are understanding the work that we do. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight that there are a couple of pieces of work that are happening outside of CADTH and in collaboration with CADTH as well. For example, we are part of the Health Technology Assessment International and the Global Policy Forum, and thinking about how and what kind of principles are required to ensure that we have good, high quality deliberative processes. And last year there was or might have been 2 years ago, actually there was a series of iterative kinds of consultations with members of the international HTA community to think about principles. Various rounds, and after 3 rounds, I think the majority of the thinking around deliberative processes along HTA came up with 3 main principles, and that was transparency, impartiality, and inclusivity. And as we look through our the harmonization work that we're doing here internally at CADTH, and as part of this consultation process, we're using those principles as a guide for us. Next slide, please. This is also, there's also work going on at a joint initiative between HTAI and ISPOR, and this is led by the 2 co-chairs, John Husserow and Via Ortwin, and thinking a little bit around, are there certain processes and task force that could all be streamlined, or are there guidance documents amongst all of the various HTAs? And so their goal is to develop some consensus in terms of the deliberation of the the definition of the deliberation process and have good clinical practice recommendations or good practice recommendations. And so all of that is happening alongside of us thinking about harmonizing the 3 expert committees along the way. So next slide, please. So just this is a reminder that these are the questions that we have for our patient groups. In context now, as you've heard some of the discussion and the information that Marina has presented, these are questions that we're interested in understanding communication and what kinds of information is required for deliberation, and then also what's the most important information that's there. Next slide, please. So we're going to open it up now to our question and answer session. It's been a very active question and answer session. And thank you for those of you who have actually provided questions along the way. I'm hoping to get to as many questions as possible. I will rely on my CADTH members and our patient community members to help answer some of those questions. I've tried to do them, I'll try and address them in chronological order in some way. And I've packaged some of the questions together that are really around methods and others that are around the patient perspective. So I'll hand some of those questions off to individuals. So maybe the first question I wanted to highlight talks a little bit about how does CADTH feel when they don't receive a submission from a patient organization on a new product or indication? How is the patient perspective then embedded into your decision making? And perhaps I can turn this over to Tamara Radar to help us understand that answer.
Oh, thanks a lot, Nicole. So that first question, can you read it to me again, please? I was just getting myself off the camera.
At 11:43. That's how
yes.
how I've organized them. How does CADTH? Or sorry, 46. How does CADTH feel when they receive?
Yeah, that I would like to say that happens very rarely. The patient groups that engage with CADTH are extremely committed, and we get, for the most part, we always get patient input. It does happen. It generally happens when the topic is not really about a disease area or somewhere where there's an organized patient group, something that maybe affects a community instead. And so we would look to past submissions from similar topics. And we would also, we realize that sometimes CADTH does receive reviews for products, submissions for products that don't pertain to a disease area where there's a group. So we are reaching out to work with communities that represent maybe multidisciplinary sort of groups in the community, seniors, members of the LGBTQ community. That might not be, we're trying to build some bridges so that we could avoid that whenever possible.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Marina, the next question I have is for you. Considering the overlap between input, throughput, and output of HTA, will input and output also be considered as part of the scope of the deliberative framework and process consultation?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question because there is so much overlap. It is hard to sort of separate the 3 buckets of information. I think there are images, or the image shows an arrow even looping back to them. So it is very hard to separate. I think we would like to hear especially about the throughput, what patients, what public, what individuals feel about what actually happens at our committee table. But I don't think, and Nicole can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we're averse to hearing about the other aspects of the process, but I think we do want to really focus in on how we can best enhance, harmonize our deliberative process at that throughput stage.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marina. I think certainly the overlap between the data that we receive as an input and then how it actually gets communicated as the output is actually part of some of this work as well. All right, so I'll turn over to another question. How, and this, Tamara, perhaps that's for you, how are patients and public members selected, and are different members selected for different diseases?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. The patient members and the public members of our expert committees are full members of the committee. So they go through the same selection process as the clinical members, the other full members of the committee. So there's an open call for membership. And you know, you'll often see an ad for it. I might pop into the chat where people can subscribe for CADTH updates so they can hear about calls for you know, applications for joining committees and things like that. So so to answer your question, yep, it's an open call for applications.
Thanks very much. There were a number of questions about that process. And so I think I hopefully have hit a couple of those questions along the way as well. There have been some questions around open meetings and confidentiality, and I maybe can add that, you know, there is some work going on to understand some of the privacy, governance, and even logistic issues around that. So we're in the process of considering some of that as well. There's another question that I have. Sorry, it came down in terms of. This was really it's Tamara, again, I'm going to shoot this one to you and to your attention. Sorry, or actually it might be a little bit for Tamara and Marina. At the throughput stage of the CDEC meeting, you mentioned that public members, who are patients and clinicians, present to CDEC during the drug review agenda. Can you elaborate? So how is the patient representative selected? And I think, Tamara, you answered some of that, but I just wanted to highlight that question as well.
Marina, would you like me to start off from what I know?
Sure, yeah, I think it probably extends on what you just described in terms of the selection.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the public or patient member of our committees are full members and have the same responsibilities as the other members. I just wanted to emphasize that when patient input comes to CADTH, it comes very early on. It really sets the tone for the researchers and the committee members. Like they get that right off the bat, almost before they start, you know, considering anything. And same thing in the deliberation. It's the very first thing that is presented. And the presentation begins by, you know, some summary of the input that was given and some implications of that when it comes to the clinical evidence. The full submission of patient input is available to all the committees, all the committee members. And so they're aware of all of it, even though the discussion might just be about part of that input. So I hope that answers the question about how patient input is delivered by the public or patient member.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Marina, anything to follow up on that?
No, that was great. Yeah, thanks, Tamara.
Thank you. Thank you. There have been a couple questions about HTERP, and namely around how does DAC fit into HTERP, or how do we find the list of potential topics? And Marina, can I turn that over to you?
So I'm not as familiar with the details of that process.
I think DAC prioritizes, looks at a list of questions and then prioritizes them, and then also considers them with respect to who asked and is the applicability across a number of jurisdictions as well. I see there's some questions about ICER. And some ICER members have actually answered the question about openness in meetings, and thank you for that. So if you look in the question and answer session, you can do so. I'm just going back to some of the questions. All right, I have one that came in just almost at the end. Let's just make sure. Sorry, we are at. There's a question around from, all right. Sorry, apologies, I've lost that question. There are so many coming in along the way. All right, so how much weight is given to stakeholder input when making a recommendation? And I think that's perhaps a Tamara and a Marina question.
Marina, did you want to start off that one?
Well, I guess so. So stakeholder input. So that's very, very broad. Just as I think on the spot here. I mean, you know, when one of the slides we highlighted this sort of 7 Ps, only there are 8 Ps on, you know, public, patient, clinicians, researchers. So I guess I would wonder which stakeholders, or if all stakeholders are considered, but I will say that stakeholder input does have a huge impact on everything that we do, on our recommendations. And, I think it really, to highlight on Tamara's point on really initial stakeholder feedback in terms of patient and public input at the start of the whole process really sets the stage for developing our protocols, for our clinical reviews, for our economic reviews. And so I think we really see that from patient groups at the start, very, very important for setting the stage. And then if we think about throughout the review process, through the input, throughput, and output, we also try to engage as much as possible with stakeholders, the actual submitter. So industry, the particular company who's submitting, we try to incorporate their feedback when we submit draft reports back to them for comment. And then when we issue a recommendation, having stakeholders comment on our draft recommendations. I think we really take that input to heart to see if there's anything that we missed during deliberations, anything that needs to be considered more as we move towards identifying a final recommendation. So I hope that touched on at least one part of where that question was coming from, but maybe I'll see if Tamara has anything more to add.
Nothing more to add, except occasionally at the feedback stage, we might hear from people who have feedback on CADTH processes or procedures. And I just wanted to say we do welcome that kind of feedback too. Like sometimes when people are giving feedback on a certain drug report, it has to do with that report, but then sometimes we'll hear things that we could improve overall, and we do take that to heart. And at the patient engagement group, we'll send that to the leadership who can consider that input as well. So just talking about feedback on a broader sort of sense of it.
Great, thank you for that answer. Another question is really related to some of the international descriptions that you provided, Marina. What is the process, if any, of learning from international HTA agencies? And should there be a process if there's not?
I like that question. I think it's a really important one and a good one that I actually don't have an answer to, but I think it's a good one to ask. And one thing that I will highlight that can help guide sort of the development of a process for doing so is those principles. So Nicole touched on the principles of transparency, impartiality, inclusivity. That's going to feed into some work by another group to look at consensus definition. And I imagine even more will come out on principles, or what those principles mean and how they should be used from that group. So I think that's all important work to do that would help inform how we can use pieces of processes from other organizations. And then the other thing I'll highlight too is, when I talked about context and all of the different considerations for context that we need to keep in mind, I think it would be quite important to have sort of a short list of, okay, what are these important or like really primary key contextual considerations that we need to keep in mind when we do look at other processes. And some things just may not work depending on those particular, I realize I'm being vague, but those particular contextual considerations. So not a direct answer, but some considerations for everyone. I think there's lots of people on the line who have a very lengthy history of experience in this area that I've learned a lot from, and I think we can all continue to learn from.
Well, and I think, Marina, you actually answered your own question, right? There are a number of groups, as we mentioned, the Global Policy Forum, which actually there's INATA, there are, ISPOR, and in fact, there was a discussion even this morning from INATA thinking about, how do we manage and deal with artificial intelligence, or how do we think about machine learning, or how do we think about tumor agnostics? And so we learn from one another, learning from experience as well. And certainly with the Global Policy Forum, the leadership around looking for how do we think about uncertainty? How do we think about deliberation? And, sort of moving each of the HTAs to really think about how their organizations manage these. So there are a number of places to go to and think about these things. And folks, I see in the chat function there or in the Q&A, there are people talking about specific jurisdictions or countries like the Netherlands and Australia. So there are lots of different ways to do that. And maybe I'll put in a pitch that one of the jobs is, along with doing an expert job and presenting how we actually deliberate, Marina has been working on an environmental scan of sort of what's happening at a number of the different health technology agencies around the country. She highlighted 3, but has done a review of a number of them, and we'll be working on that to put that into a report and document. And then perhaps there are different opportunities about how we actually leverage that information along the way. I did want to highlight that there are a number of people asking about slides. So yes, slides will be available as PDF on the events page of the CADTH's website. And moreover, this session itself will be recorded and will be on our CADTH YouTube channel as well. So I just think that there are a number of questions. We've tried to answer some of them around expert panel members and patients, and maybe maybe I'll try and get to 2 more before we end the session. How are expert panel members selected for rare disease evaluation? Marina, do you think I can turn that to you, or is that something more that Tamara can answer?
No, I think we've maybe lost Tamara here.
Okay, all right. So I would say for an open call, our experts are actually, there's an open call for experts to contribute to our deliberation panels as well. So maybe just as I know we have lots of questions here, I just thought maybe Martine, do you have any thoughts or questions? Anything that was a light bulb moment for you as we presented? Anything that, or you had any questions that you wanted to share?
Thank you, Nicole. I've just been monitoring some of the questions, some very interesting questions. And one of them that I think would be interesting in exploring is the whole issue of clinical trial design. And how can clinical trial design include patient preference in a way that would help CADTH in the HTA process, in their deliberative process, to address some of the patient needs. So instead of coming at the end when the therapy is, sort of approved, how can we influence some of the designs of clinical trials so that we make sure that the patient's consideration and outcomes are included?
So, I mean, maybe I can start and then turn that over to Marina. I mean, certainly some of the clinical trial designs are incorporating quality of life measures, patient-reported outcome measures, patient preference tools, for example, and then that can all be considered then along the deliberation, at the deliberation table along the way, including then the patient input. Marina, anything else to add there?
Not really. I think it is a good question, Martine. Like, I think there is opportunity there in clinical trial design to make sure that what matters most to patients is actually being collected. So I think there are opportunities. I mean, I'm speaking from, I guess, a perspective of the deliberative processes. So I mean, there are probably a lot of people on the call or even on the team who have more to add than I do, but just to say that is an important consideration, because I think during our committee meetings, there's often outcomes that would be nice to have that aren't available from the clinical trial data. So that would be an area of uncertainty that our committees would experience that could be helped with clinical trial design.
Thanks. And I see we have Tamara back. And Tamara, I'm not sure how much you heard of that question, but perhaps.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Martine, for raising it. The only thing I would add to what Marina and Nicole have already said is that another opportunity for patient involvement is through CADTH's scientific advice program. And this is a fee-for-service program that CADTH offers to manufacturers, to sponsors, so that when they're at the very, very early stages of doing drug development, we do engage patients at that point to talk about trial design, important outcomes, even simple things like what would improve recruitment, like very, very patient-centered questions. That goes into the advice that CADTH gives to manufacturers through that program. So I'll just let people know that all the details of what I'm saying are on our website as well. So there's, I would say, just go there if you wanted to learn more.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe we'll wrap this up with one final question. And this is a little bit for, I think, Martine and Tamara. Say for patient organizations that have never submitted before or are new to patient stakeholder input, do you have suggestions around the submission or examples or how they can learn more?
I'll just start if that's okay. I mean, contact other patient organization. There's many organizations that have experience in developing submissions, and you can just look on the CADTH website to see which therapeutic area may be, closest to yours, and contact that specific patient organization. And I'm sure they would be more than happy to help you in developing your strategy, your questions, and your report. So that would be my first recommendation.
That's excellent, Martine, because we do have a lot of excellent patient submissions that come through from many groups, and there's a lot of experience out there in the community. Also like to say that every patient input submission is on CADTH's website along with the drug that's being reviewed. So you can just see what's been submitted in the past. And I just want to take a moment and say that CADTH really recognizes the diversity of patient groups. We get input from national, big organizations across the country, and we get handwritten patient input from small support groups in rural areas. And so I don't want people to be discouraged or intimidated by the process. We have our guide, we have our template on a website as a suggestion, but there's a real range of what CADTH receives, and we present it all to the committee and we share it with the committee members. So we can also, if you contacted CADTH, we can also help you and give you some support and ideas if you wanted to make sure that you can do something within your resources that's not too onerous. So thank you.
Can I just make, two very quick points? One is that next week's session is the opportunity for all of our patient organization to come back and provide input and insights from the discussion today. And I really want to commend the CADTH team, because one of the things that Nicole said earlier this week is that they're here to listen, but they're also here to hear what we say. So to me, that makes a big difference, because people can listen, but they don't always hear what we say. So that's really important. The other thing I wanted to sort of maybe, I don't know if we have time to discuss today, maybe it's next week, is the use of real world evidence in the deliberative process. Is that something that, is considered? So you may want to make a recommendation, but the collection of real world evidence can further that recommendation, and is that considered in the deliberative process?
So, I mean, there are a number of initiatives going on at CADTH with respect to real world evidence and considering how and what kind of evidence is required from a patient perspective. A patient perspective is really important to understand. So we're starting to look at, what are the outcomes that are meaningful, and then how do we incorporate some of that information in our processes as well. So where along the process and how and with what methods along the way. So there's a fair bit of work going on in the background there. So thanks for raising that. So I think we've had now 82 questions, and I apologize that I haven't gotten to them all. I've tried to lump a couple of questions from folks that were similar into one another. We may not have gotten to all of them, but certainly we really do appreciate them, and we'll have a list of questions ourselves, and that will help us move forward. Again, just wanted to highlight that we do have our session on February 11th for the patient groups, and this is where we can ask some of the consultation that we typically do in written format. And because we have the benefit of being virtual. We're going to try something different this time. So, and in a collaborative and engaged manner, we hope. I just wanted to say that this sort of brings us to the end of today's session. A really big thank you to Marina and to the patient group and representatives, and Tamara for putting her on the spot for answering questions, and the rest of the CADTH staff who really helped put this webinar together and this session together. And we really are looking forward to next week's consultation session with the patients. So as mentioned already, next week is an opportunity for patients and patient groups and patient representatives to provide input to help us refine some of the information that we look at during the deliberation, and to help us improve some of the deliberation process. As mentioned, we've typically only received this in a written feedback, so we're piloting something new and really would like to have your feedback on that. We're quite interested in hearing if this is something that was useful to gathering feedback. Certainly there will be other opportunities for other interested parties, and we'll try and understand what those opportunities are and think about, are there other audiences we would need information from and using potentially this format. So please let us know what you thought of today's session, and there will be an evaluation survey that you'll receive. Was it valuable? Is it anything that we didn't touch base on? I know we didn't get to all the questions. Apologies about that. But please keep an eye on the CADTH website for information on upcoming events. As mentioned already, this webinar will be posted on the CADTH YouTube channel, and we'll make the slides available as well through the CADTH events page. So until next time, continue to wash your hands, wear a mask, and stay safe. Thanks very much, and enjoy your afternoon.